Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights, Asia Pacific Demographic Transitions. I am Panwin Yoking, a fellow at the East-West Center, and I am delighted to be moderating today's event. Thank you for joining this event live, and thank you to those who are watching the YouTube recording. Our EWC Insights this afternoon features Dr. Gretchen Donehower. Dr. Donehower is a research specialist with the Center on the Economics and Demography of Aging at UC Berkeley. She is also an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center. She works with the National Transfer Accounts Project, which is focused on understanding the age dimension of economic activity. She is the principal investigator of the Counting Women's Work project, and she has worked as a statistician in a private industry and was a math teacher in the US Peace Corps in Nepal. And in today's session, Dr. Donehower will review the Counting Women's Work results, focusing on unpaid care work from research teams in over 20 countries. And before we start, just a brief note on the session's logistics. Dr. Donehower's presentation will be roughly 40 minutes long. Then we will transition to a 20-minute Q&A session. And to participate in the Q&A session, please submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box down below, and we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. And just a quick announcement that the speaker for our next EWC Insights will be Dong Woodring, and his talk will be focusing on reducing Southeast Asia plastic footprint. And his presentation will be on September 15th at 2 p.m. So if you're interested, watch for an email with a registration link in your mailbox. And in the interest of time, I will hand this over to Dr. Donehower to start her presentation.
Thank you very much, Panwin. Let me start sharing my screen so that everyone can see the slides. And launch into the slideshow. All righty, hopefully that looks okay. So as Panwin said, what I'm going to be talking about today is the Counting Women's Work project and what we've learned about it. So Counting Women's Work began out of the National Transfer Accounts project, which many of you are familiar with if you're following East-West Center research, because Andy Mason, one of the founding members of the network, is a senior fellow, and Sang-Hap Lee is another senior fellow, who was also one of the founding members of that project. And so that project was about understanding the age dimension of economic activity. So it produces estimates like this. So what you're looking at is an example from a recent year for the United States. Per capita flows by age, there are three different ones shown here. So production here is labor income. So that's income earned working in the labor market, wages and benefits. It's also self-employment income. And then the red line is consumption. So that's private consumption, food, clothing, shelter, et cetera, that we purchase for ourselves. And then also public consumption, education, health, or other services that are provided to us by the government. And what you get when you subtract consumption minus production is the green line on the right that shows the life cycle deficit. So what this shows is that children and elders have to get net resources, transfers of net resources, either from private means, which is sort of family transfers, or other private institutions, or public transfers, so taxes and benefits to the government, or often in old age, we use resources that we save during our working age to then consume during old age. So those areas of the green curve that are above zero line represent net transfers that have to be gained from other age groups. So the purpose of that project is to understand the age dimension of our economies. But We knew as we were starting to get NTA going in many countries that there were lots of other ways to slice the data that would show us what economic lives really were like. So one obvious way to further divide the data is by sex. And I should say here that, I mean, I suppose this should more properly be titled NTA by gender, as here we are just using whatever data is included with the survey data that we use. So whatever people checked on those boxes, male or female, and certainly in the future, there may be other ways to look at this data that complicate gender. But here we're just looking at sort of what people ticked on that box in survey sources. So what we see here is when we pull NTA apart, so the blue lines on the left are labor income, that production indicator, for men in the solid blue, for women in the dotted blue. And you can see that men are earning more than women at every age. Now the red line separated into the solid for men, dotted for women is pretty close. The consumption estimates don't differ that much. And so what we end up with is the picture on the right. The green dotted line shows a life cycle deficit for women that is almost completely above zero. So women on average, and I should stress that this is on average in a cross section, there are plenty of women who are producing more than they're consuming, and but on average at each age, we find that it's generally that women are getting net transfers, while during those peak working ages, on average, men are making transfers to women and to other age groups. So the idea that women are on average producing no surplus at all seems a pretty astounding pattern. And so what explains this? And what explains this is a big part of the economy that's missing from this picture. And why is it missing? So now I'm going to get into a conversation about how we know what the economy is, how we know what economic lives are. So yeah, this is a lot of writing, but we will go through it and you'll understand why I'm sort of making you think about all this. So what you're looking at here is a report from Simon Kuznets, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who was one of the fathers, and I should say fathers is the correct word here, of national accounting. So, and this report particularly was written in 1934. So national accounting was really getting developed after the big crashes of 1929, during the Great Depression, because economists, policymakers, social scientists, statisticians understood that in order to understand the problem that the Great Depression was presenting the world and to work to solve it and to know if those solutions were doing any good or not, you have to measure these things, and you have to measure them on a comparative basis for countries and within countries over time. So they did a great deal of work to establish sort of how do you measure the economy of a whole country? How do you measure its production? And that gave us measures like gross domestic product, income, national income measures, etc. So this is an excerpt from the report to the Senate committee that was overseeing this work, and it begins as so. The volume of services rendered by housewives and other members of the household toward the satisfaction of wants must be imposing indeed, when totaled for the 30 million families comprising the population of this country. And the item is thus large enough to affect materially any estimate of national income. Okay, so just to paraphrase, what he's saying is that he can see that there are a lot of housewives doing a lot of work in households. They're not getting paid for it, but it makes up a very large part of what everyone is consuming and also what everyone is producing. Okay, so far so good. Next part. But the organization of these services render them an integral part of family life at large, rather than of the specifically business life of the nation. Such services are therefore quite removed from those which gainfully occupied groups undertake to perform in return for wages, salaries, or profits. So we started off saying the unpaid work of housewives and other household members is big, and it's a big part of national income. Now he says, however, this is fundamentally different to the production that is taking place for wages, salaries, or profits. Okay, fair enough. But then in the end, it was considered best to omit this large group of services from national income, especially since no reliable basis is available for estimating their value. Okay, so here he's saying, this seems like a very different beast to me, the unpaid work done by housewives and other household members. And it's hard to measure. I don't have a reliable basis to measure it because it's not trading in a market where I can measure the cost or measure the salary that people are being paid. So the idea that you leave something out of your analysis because it's hard to measure, I've done that plenty of times. That seems fairly legitimate. And you say, this is outside of the current estimates. However, there are other things that they eventually did include in national accounting, which are equally hard to measure. Things like the food generated by households, gardens, and subsistence agriculture. So food that households grow themselves for their own consumption, that never trade hands in the market, so they're hard to measure. But they did find some ways to guess at that amount, and those are included in national income measures. Similarly, things like the flow of housing services provided by an owned home, that's also included in national income, even though it's hard to measure because you don't have to pay yourself rent to live in a home that you own or a home that you are paying the mortgage on. So, so this ends up with a system of inherently gendered economic measurement. So this 2x2 grid shows goods and services are in the columns, and then whether they are sold in the marketplace or produced and consumed in the household in the rows. So in the 4 cells of this table, we get 3 things that are included in national income, but that's goods and services sold in the marketplace, and then goods that are produced and consumed in the household are also included. They're estimated or imputed. But then services produced and consumed in the household are not. So another way to understand this is think of a potato. A household wants to grow a potato to eat. The seed, the fertilizer, the labor to grow the potato are all included in national income measurements. But once that potato gets to the household door, there's no more measurement. The labor to cook it and put it on the table and then clean up after the meal, that's outside of it. But without all of that labor, you'd be eating a raw potato. So it's important to figure out how to include this left out piece, these services that are produced and consumed in the household. And so that's what Counting Women's work is all about, measuring the gendered economy and adding that to the National Transfer Accounts project looking at the generational economy. So we do that, measure the gendered economy by starting from a base of household production satellite accounting. So this is a long-standing research tradition going back to economists and other social scientists who said that these unpaid household services needed to be included as part of income. And they estimated their value by looking at time use surveys, how much time people spent on these activities, so caring for other persons, doing housework, etc. And then valued that time by an imputed or replacement market wage. So if I wasn't, for example, going to do laundry in my household, instead I would pay someone else to do it, how much would they get paid to do that? And so, and there are other ways to value the time spent in these unpaid services in a monetary way, but this is the household production satellite accounting uses this replacement wage. And then to that household production satellite accounting, we add the NTA age disaggregation and the NTA framework on estimating transfers between age groups. So, and the age disaggregation for this unpaid care work is particularly important because care work is a very age-determined phenomenon. So you need a lot of care when you're very young or very, very old. And you are providing a lot of this care during your peak childbearing, child raising ages. Your personal care economy changes as your household changes. So these are very age-determined phenomena. So the NTA age disaggregation is very important in understanding how this care economy works. And so Counting Women's Work's goal is to value everyone's work, even if it's outside of the traditional market-based measures of work, and measure everyone's care. So that picture on the left there is my husband. He makes beer. He works as a brewer, so he's there producing his market goods, and that work is included in GDP. And here he is producing non-market services, so vacuuming and taking care of that kid who is now 13. So been talking about this for a while. And so all of the stuff in that right-hand panel should certainly be included as work, just as much as producing beer. So we've been applying this methodology to as many countries in the National Transfer Accounts Project, which now has over 70 research teams, but as many countries as were interested for their own research purposes and also have time use data available, which is much less available on a global scale compared to things like labor force surveys and consumption surveys and things like that. So what have we learned? Just to blow the lead here and tell you all the things we've learned, I'll go down this list and then show a group of charts that kind of back up each one of these claims. So what have we learned? We learned about the size and importance of the care economy. It's big, it's unpaid by and large. Most of the work is done by women. Age patterns of care production differ from country to country quite a bit. Unpaid care work creates the future. It's the first building block of human capital. And then for discussions that focus around population aging, one of the important things to realize that this work shows us is that young children are care expensive. What we see in the data so far is that older people are much less care expensive. And in fact, many older persons up until very old ages in different countries are net care producers. So that's important for keeping in mind in terms of thinking about the global phenomenon of population aging. So to start showing all my pictures, here is a picture of the unpaid care work economy in terms of time. So what you're looking at for a group of 18 different countries that vary widely across geographic region, across level of income and cultural background, things that would affect care economies, is a distribution of total work hours. So we look at the time use survey, count up the hours that everyone is spending on two different types of work and look at the shares. So the unpaid care work share is shown in red, and that includes two types of care work. One is the direct care, that is care for children, care for frail elders, care for sick or disabled persons, that is a direct interaction. And then it also includes indirect care work. So that's the care that is provided through housework like cooking, cleaning, laundry, also household maintenance and management. So those are also in that red bar there. And then market work is work that you get paid for, or work you do for a household-owned enterprise that makes money and you work for it even if you don't receive a wage yourself. So Spain in this group of countries has the greatest share of total work devoted to unpaid care work. That's at about 60%. And then all the way down to the bottom is Thailand. Now this is 2014, there's a more recent survey, but we haven't gone through that yet. So then at 30% is Thailand. So that's a great deal of overall work effort in these economies that's going to unpaid work for it to be so invisible in terms of research on labor markets, research on overall work effort. So this type of work is also big in terms of money. So if I take the replacement wage, so the imputed replacement wage I was discussing before, and take all that time and value it at a replacement wage for those services, then I can compare that to the monetary amount of some big aggregate measure. In this case, for this chart, gross domestic product. And so these countries are sorted by per capita income. So at the US, the total unpaid care work valued at this replacement wage is about 30% compared to GDP. In Germany and Italy, it goes much higher because they have higher minimum wages relative to their GDP, and also that those minimum wages generally are in effect. Now, down at the lowest income level is Senegal at about 22% relative to GDP. Now, the Vietnam bar has that little gold, or sorry, yellow star at the bottom. So that's to represent two different imputed wages. So the higher one is the statutory minimum wage. But we know that in many countries, the statutory minimum wage isn't enforced, or it only applies to certain sectors of workers, or there's a large informal economy for whom the minimum legal minimum wage is not relevant. So the higher number, almost 50%, is that legal minimum wage. And then the lower number, about 17%, is a more sort of realistic replacement measure. What would a household have to pay to hire somebody to do the unpaid care work? So you could get a really large range of these monetary valued measures for unpaid care work, depending on how you're choosing the replacement wage. Most of the overall care economy is in the unpaid care sector. So what you're looking at here is for just two countries, United States and Korea. So, and just because we've only kind of gone into the paid sector for these two countries, hopefully we'll be able to do this for a lot more countries. And this is the direct care portion of the care economy only, because we wanted to compare paid care workers to unpaid care workers. And on direct care, it's much easier to go into the market economy and pick out those sort of substitutable or similar kinds of activities. Whereas for housework, for a broad list of housework, there are just so many different kinds of workers that, and it's a less clear and obvious sort of comparison. So we're still working on that. But for the direct care economy, what you're looking at is the proportion of hours worked in that sector by three different types of workers. So in blue, both countries, about over 90% of the total hours are unpaid care workers providing direct care for adults, children, sick or disabled persons. And then this little red slice in the middle are paid care workers who are sort of less credentialed. So these are home health aides, these are childcare workers. Now in both countries, certainly there are plenty of regulatory requirements for those types of workers, but the education and the credentialing requirements are less. And then in the green slice at the top are paid care workers who are sort of more credentialed. So teachers, nurses, doctors, and social workers who typically have to get years of education and training and then have sort of stringent credentialing requirements. But what we see overall is that both types of paid care workers at the aggregate level are providing far less, are providing a much smaller slice of the total care demand compared to the unpaid care workers. And keep on moving away from my slides. So most of this work is done by women. What you're looking at here for a group of countries, again, diverse by region, income, and lots of other characteristics, the share of men's versus women's time in producing unpaid care work. So the blue dots are for men, the red dots are for women. Every single country here, the red dot is quite farther to the right of 50%, and the blue dot is to the left. Even in the closest country here, Denmark at the very bottom, we're looking at 30% men providing these hours and 70% women. Now, this is not to take a total shot at men, because as we saw before, they are doing, or at least they're earning a lot more in the paid labor market. And if we look at their paid labor, they're also doing a great deal of paid labor. But right now we're just focusing on this care economy piece. So there's a great deal of variability in age patterns of care. So what you're looking at here for a group of 18 countries are in the red solid lines, showing the hours per week on average that women are producing, by age. And then the dashed lines are that unpaid care work that men are producing in hours per week. And many of the countries here have the shape that is on the top left, sort of like Bangladesh. So the women's peak unpaid care work is in those peak childbearing ages in the 20s and 30s. And then the care work goes down with age groups that are older. And these are, again, cross sections. This is not sort of one person over time. This is a cross section of society at one time. But a lot of countries have a shape more like Colombia, which is right next to Bangladesh, where the women and sometimes the men as well have sort of two local maximum in the amount of time they're spending on unpaid care work. One in those peak childbearing ages, and then a later one at older ages. And so we also see that in Germany. Italy has one, Mongolia, Spain, down at the bottom, Vietnam, the US a little bit. And this is also in some of the other countries that we're still working on. I believe the Philippines also has this. And what this is that older women, some of it can be cohort change, that those older women didn't have much labor force attachment while they were younger. And so they are continuing to focus more on unpaid care work than market work, but a lot of it is also likely kind of a different way of thinking about care, and that those old women are both taking care of their grandchildren so that their adult children can maximize their labor market attachments. And they're also beginning to take care of older spouses in frail health. And we see some of this for men as well, but there's a lot more of women doing this than men. And so there's more detail that we can talk about in just how older women are contributing to the care economy, but we can discuss that later if there's time. So, sorry about that. So the next chart that I want to show you is about the role of unpaid care work in creating human capital. So what this donut here shows is estimates across 17 different countries of the shares that market goods and services made up of the cost of a child's first year compared to unpaid care work. So market goods and services are the food, clothing, shelter, whatever public services were provided for a child. If there's sort of a public healthcare subsidy or provision, that's going to be in that market goods and services piece. And then the green part is unpaid care work, the amount of hours that a child consumes in care, valued at the cost of an average childcare worker. And those wages are pretty low generally in the labor market context in the countries that we've looked at so far. And so 10% market goods and services, 90% unpaid care work. Now, this is the cost of a child's first year, and these shares go down as we look at older groups of children. So the market goods and services share will grow as a child gets older, and the unpaid care work share will decrease. But still, for the first year of a child's life, this was a pretty astounding result to me. Now, it doesn't contain things like breast milk, which some economists are arguing should also be included in aggregate measures like gross domestic product, but because it's sort of a foodstuff produced for own household consumption. However, it is completely left out. So 90% of an infant's first year is unpaid care work. So another thing that we're learning from counting women's work estimates is who is care expensive in a society. So this, for 18 different countries, the red line is an average hours per week in net unpaid care work time. So that is the consumption of unpaid care work time minus the production of it. So it's sort of a net transfer. And in every single country, the greatest consumers of this are children. So looking at that donut chart I just showed, you would think, okay, that makes sense because they're consuming so much of this unpaid care work time. What is a little more surprising, I think, is how, and I should say, so the lines for the youngest children are above 0. That means they're net consumers of unpaid care work time. And then we get into peak working ages. The lines are below 0. That means those age groups are making net time transfers to others. But the thing that is surprising to me here is how close to 0 the lines are, even for the oldest age groups, and some of them significantly below 0, like in the bottom Uruguay and Vietnam row, until quite old ages, older persons are making net time transfers. And if I had separated these out by sex, you would see that on average, the big net time transfers are coming from older women. Men are generally not making net transfers of time at all in most countries. And that's sort of the mirror image of that very first chart I showed that looked like women are at every age group needing to get, on average, net transfers of market resources from men. So this would be sort of the flip side if I separated these out. Okay, so done with the charts. I hope everyone's been with me so far. So why should we care about these empirical findings? What do they mean for policy? Well, one of the reasons we should care is that the UN cares now. So unpaid care work is now part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So under the gender equality header, we have goal 5.4 to recognize and value unpaid care work and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and family as nationally appropriate. So enough people in the UN network and developing the Sustainable Development Goals saw unpaid care work as a really important part of an overall gender equality strategy to include this in the UN framework to have a specific unpaid care work goal. There are other implications of these findings that are pretty important. And as far as sort of exact policy recommendations, that's going to vary from country to country. But overall, I think the nature of this unpaid care work as being unpaid and also largely feminized leads to some policy blind spots. Having it outside of our traditional measures of economic activity similarly leads to policy blind spots. So a big example of this is that we didn't plan for the pandemic impacts on the care economy. Of course, you could say we didn't plan on the pandemic at all. But it was, at least in the US press, I think, largely a big surprise to many that immediately closing schools and daycares and other after-school programs was going to have a huge impact on the labor market. And I think we now still see the problems with this blind spot in that the economic recovery is slowed because the care economy is still impacted. So we are still seeing perhaps more unemployment than we would if people had, if we hadn't closed so many daycares in the United States. I'm sure there are similar dynamics going on in other countries, but workers are not just workers. Workers are embedded in families, and families have care responsibilities. We also see a policy blind spot that can be underinvestment in infrastructure. So if a government, a city, a nation is looking at cost benefit analyses for, say, public transportation, and the only thing in the benefit column is benefits to the market economy, they're missing out on the fact that improving transportation systems makes the unpaid care work economy more productive as well. So what to do to address these policy blind spots? Well, I certainly think support time use data collection, because this data is definitely not considered a standard part in most countries of their kind of basic data collection which is more about labor markets and prices and things like that. And then support research on the care economy, because we need everyone to know all of this research. And embed care in policy documents, tools, and plans. So Counting Women's work has had some successes in this in different countries, of including in planning documents and in briefing books for certain different ministry meetings and things like that, to get these results into those documents so people can begin to discuss the care economy in the same ways that they discuss other aspects of the economy. And then another finding, I think, especially going back to that donut chart, is that unpaid care work is a social good, not just a burden or barrier to women's economic empowerment. And I certainly have talked about care work, unpaid care work in these terms plenty. That's one of the big interests in policy circles, is the extent to which it is keeping women out of paid labor. However, looking at the relative size of inputs to young children stresses the importance of care for human capital investment as well. So instead of just trying to, or speaking about unpaid care work as a burden or a barrier, I think that it would be better to think about it in terms of social investment that we want to share the responsibility for more equitably so that women are not disadvantaged. So what to do about this? Certainly subsidize unpaid care work, and not strictly in sort of paying people to stay home, but I think many countries are increasing their sort of child allowances and family allowances to recognize the value of this unpaid care work. Excuse me, and what families forego, the opportunity cost to families of doing this kind of work. Another thing we can do is invest more in developing the paid care economy. So one of the reasons that in those that chart of the United States and Korea that showed what a small fraction of the direct care provision was by paid workers is that, especially for the less credentialed workers, those are not great jobs. They pay very little. They often have very little access to benefits in different places, in different countries, are not covered by any sort of social protection schemes. They're outside of a lot of traditional benefits of paid work. And if we make those jobs better jobs, we will get better paid care, and we will get more flexibility for families to provide care for their dependents through their own unpaid care work and quality paid care providers. And then another thing that we can do to share the responsibility for unpaid care work more equitably is structuring family policy to involve fathers more. There have been several studies of changes in family policy that involved including not just a parent benefit or not just a maternity benefit, but specifically a paternity benefit. So that a father would have the option to stay home and be paid for staying home to provide unpaid care work. And if he didn't, then he would not receive the benefit. And so in the studies looking at the effects of those policies, they have shown that fathers who did stay home with their children, not only, of course, when they were at home as the unpaid care work provider provided a lot of family care, but then once those programs were over, that the family aged out of them, those fathers continued to provide more unpaid care to their children and to their households than fathers who did not take part in those programs, and countries that did not change their programs to include this paternity benefit. So that's at least sort of one way that we've found to change the ideas about what is sort of the gender aspect of unpaid care work. So there are certainly more that we could go into, but I'm pretty sure this was the last slide. Yes, because I wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time for Q&A, and I hope that I'll be able to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for your attention, everyone.
Thank you, Gretchen, for the excellent presentation on unpaid care work. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. And the first question we have is, the NTA does not measure income from migrants because it is difficult to measure. How is this different from KUSNET omitting the value of housework because it could not be measured?
Okay, so there is a large diversity across different countries how they incorporate the work of migrants, whether those migrants are considered part of the their home economy or part of the economy that they migrated to, and how sort of the remittances affect the economy and how well their national accountants are able to capture that and include that in their measures. So, but on the unpaid care work side, it's a little more straightforward because the vast majority of these transfers are happening within households. We just need a time use survey that is going to allow us to capture that. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of countries don't have a time use survey, but there is so much new interest in capturing these kinds of labor inputs that a lot of countries are including, they're including sections in their main labor market surveys that ask about time spent in unpaid care work or housework and things like that. So those kinds of additions to existing surveys are much more cost effective to get at this kind of data, but it's a little lower quality. So hopefully we can find a happy medium where it's cost effective to get time use data and in the most accurate way possible, given the financial constraints that governments face in collecting data.
Right, that's true. Especially the case of Nepal, their time use data is embedded in their labor force survey, but it doesn't really provide a lot of information on women's unpaid care work. Okay, yeah. So moving on to the next question. Does unpaid care work include grandparents taking care of their children or only the work of the parents?
Absolutely, it includes grandparents. So the way these surveys work is they, like any big national survey, they try to get a random sampling of all the people in the country. So that's across all age groups, across all areas. You know, some do it better or worse depending on the sort of statistical infrastructure. But yeah, they're looking at the time spent by all people in society. And so we look at older person's time use, and if they are providing care to children, even if there aren't children in their household, so if say the grandparents live separately, we can still pick that up. Now, there's a big concern, I think, in terms of the measuring the work of older persons, that a lot of the care for older persons can be harder to measure compared to the care for children. There seems to be a lot more broad international consensus on what caring for a child looks like versus caring for an elder. So everyone agrees that if there is actual sickness or disability, we know what that care looks like. But if there's sort of monitoring activities or say helping out with housework that is happening for an older person, a lot of that can get coded as just sort of social time, which it is as well, but there's sort of more monitoring of, say, well-being perhaps. So those studies, to get a better read on that, we definitely need to get better tools to look at elder care.
Okay, got it. The next question is, are there any examples of comparisons of sex disaggregated care work and market work across different labor sectors, such as agriculture versus fisheries?
Ooh. So you mean like how much paid work we look at the total fisheries sector, how much time people are working in that, and whether that's broken out for men versus women?
That's how I would understand the question too.
So I think that the International Labor Organization has some of that data. They have a big report. I mean, of course, they have reports on labor force all the time, but they have a big effort to really incorporate gender in all of their reporting tools. So I am most familiar with a big report they did a few years ago on unpaid care work, but they also are incorporating gender much more systematically in their other reporting tools. So, and that kind of goes along with what I was sort of saying, that hopefully the future is more disaggregation in all of our kinds of reporting tools. Gender disaggregation is a very important one, very basic. But then there are all sorts of other kinds of disaggregation that people are calling for more and more. So I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not familiar with this. Certainly the data exists to calculate it. But the ability to sort of go and kind of Google it and find it right now, I don't know exactly, but the ILO would be a place to start.
Okay, the next question we have is, the general understanding is that Scandinavian countries do a job of supporting women's work and involving fathers more. Do your statistics support this perception?
Yes, definitely. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland generally have closer to 50-50. Nowhere is any place 50-50, or even 55-45, but Denmark and the Nordics get closer generally. So that is certainly part of the perception. Iceland as well. And they have a long history of having policies that support that. So when I was talking about paternity leave, it's the Nordic countries that instituted that first and have been studying it for the longest period of time. So yeah, they definitely have sort of more of a history of gender egalitarianism, but they also sort of got there first, but have stalled out like many other countries. I mean, that's certainly the case in the United States, that sort of increasing women's market labor force participation and increasing men's participation in unpaid care work. The change was much more rapid in, say, the 70s and 80s and 90s, and now it's very much flat. We don't see any more evidence of real conversion in households, or very slow. And the same is kind of true in the Nordic countries, that they're certainly at a level that's more gender equal than most other countries, but they are not progressing very quickly towards any more gender egalitarian situation. So they're also looking at policies that will help that. And there is a lot more interest coming in sort of gender egalitarian policies in high income countries as it impacts on low fertility. So there are a lot of countries with low sub-replacement fertility who are looking for research on what might increase fertility. And there's not really anything we've seen that has a huge impact, that, you know, you just increase family payments X amount of dollars and you get an extra baby a year. Like, we don't have any evidence of that works. But it does seem that the countries that make it more possible for women to both work in the market and have families are having less of this problem than countries where it's much more kind of culturally supported and supported by labor markets, that women are either working or they're taking care of families. So, you know, and that does seem to be borne out by the experience of those Nordic countries, although everyone is kind of dealing with sub-replacement fertility, but they're not sort of below 1.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Gretchen. The next question is, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna try and squeeze in as many questions as possible. So the next question pertains to climate change. Do you have any ideas on how climate change could affect women's work?
Well, certainly in terms of market work, women make up a large section of family agricultural laborers. And so this is true in many areas in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the extent to which climate change is really going to make it harder to be a smallhold farmer or to supplement household income through kind of growing food yourself, that burden is going to fall very heavily on women. In terms of unpaid care work, so also in sub-Saharan Africa mostly, but in a few other places as well, a lot of the unpaid care work that women are doing, although it's kind of conceptually close to market work, is getting water and getting wood for fuel. And so those activities take a whole lot of time, and climate change is going to make them harder to do. So to the extent that it is possible to have infrastructure investments that provide alternative forms of energy other than just wood, that provide alternative ways to get water, that maybe prevent evaporation, things like that. There are some possibilities for really improving both the unpaid care situation of women and also general well-being in response to climate change. I certainly think, as I was saying before, that in kind of pricing the cost benefit of those investments, that if they include this unpaid care work piece, it will be much more obvious that they need to make those investments. Because at least in terms of things like rural electrification, I mean, that's largely a done deal. In most places, if you don't have electricity yet, it's because you're very far out from a central area. And it's very costly for the government to sort of extend those systems out. But it's possible that it will seem more cost effective, like a better investment, if all of the unpaid care work impacts are included in the calculations where they decide sort of, okay, we have this much money to, string electricity lines or piped water systems this much further. And so, if we're calculating the benefits in a more holistic way, maybe we can make some of those investments.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, some policymakers, they see women, especially highly educated women, in unpaid work as underutilized resource in the economy. And the Counting Women's work is showing that this is not necessarily the case. So the question is, what is the CWW's experience in changing the mindset of policymakers?
Yeah, so this is a big question, and it is sometimes hard to talk about. I have occasionally been accused of trying to reduce the gross domestic love in a country by arguing that sort of, paid work should replace some unpaid care work, or that, I'm trying to destroy families and things like that. So as I think that big donut chart, the 90% of inputs to infants being in the form of unpaid care work, makes the case that unpaid care work is not just a consumption good. And this is sort of an issue with the way that at least the National Transfer Accounts often talks about all consumption of young people. We talk about it as a consumption good, and that's also part of how national accounting is set up. When really, consumption by young people is also investment that the whole society makes in the future. So I certainly don't think that it is an inefficient use of time to take care of children, no matter who the caretaker is. The question is, are those time resources being allocated in a way that plays to the strengths of each care provider and each market worker? Or is it just stuck in a groove of social acceptability that is now causing an inefficient allocation of people's productive capacities? So if it's the former, if everyone is sort of working at their most efficient use of time, and some of that is market work and some of that is raising kids or taking care of others, then I think the market has done its job. It's an efficient allocation. If it's the latter, where people are tracked before we even really understand what any relative sort of strength and weakness of particular workers are, then we have a problem. And I didn't show any of the graphs about this, but one of the other findings in counting women's work is that as young as those time surveys go, and even specialized time use surveys that focus on youth time use, that the minute a kid can walk upright and hold a rake, girls are taking care of their siblings and helping their mothers with domestic work, and boys are doing sort of unpaid family labor. They're taking care of livestock. And this is in a lower income country context where their children are doing a lot of work. And so those boys, they're taking care of livestock, they're helping with farming activities, they're helping in sort of store family-owned shops and things. And so as young as we see kids, we see sort of the social patterning of their human capital to do women's work or men's work. And so in an economy that now is changing so rapidly, where the concepts of women's and men's work is really shifting quickly, this seems like an inefficient way to allocate productive resources, and deserves a rethinking and some critical attention.
Okay, since we have about 3 minutes left, I'm gonna squeeze in about 2 more questions. So one question is, are there feminist theoretical framework that support women's unpaid care work?
Certainly there are, and one of the advisors to counting women's work is Nancy Fulbright, who is a heterodox feminist economist and has argued for the importance and the centrality of unpaid care work for a long time, and is also one of the persons arguing for things like breast milk being included in production measures and stuff. And I mean, it's with 3 minutes, I don't have quite enough time to sort of elucidate those things on a large scale, but there are a lot of feminist arguments for unpaid care work being considered the central work of societies versus being sort of, as I was mentioning before, sort of a barrier or a burden on women's economic empowerment. So there are lots of different ways that feminists are looking for it, and they don't always agree.
Okay, and this could be potentially the last question, and that is, one solution to aging offered by some is to increase labor force participation. Does your work offer insights about this idea?
Yes, absolutely. So one particular working paper that comes to mind is by Pamela Jimenez Fontana from Costa Rica. So she looked at a policy goal of the Costa Rican government, increasing women's, especially older women's market economic participation by sort of 4%, and was able to estimate, given the unpaid care work those women are doing, how much of that unpaid care work time would we need to substitute for those women to not sort of go further into time poverty, or not to increase their total work when they're also already doing a lot of unpaid care work. So it was a data-driven way to sort of estimate, while you're trying to increase some people's market work, how much sort of increase in, say, paid care workers should you also plan for, so that the work that people are already doing in households that's not paid doesn't go wanting, or doesn't actually decrease the well-being of the workers who you're trying to get to do more for you.
Got it. Thank you. We have a lot of excellent questions left, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So thank you very much, Gretchen, for sharing your insights on unpaid care work, and to all our audience and participants for joining us today. And I invite you to join our EWC Insights on September 15th at 2 p.m. for a talk by Dawn Woodring. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.